Sometimes I sit with friends of mine who have very young children to eat, say. And the children, 2 or 3 years old, don't sit at the table, they sit on the table, or they run around the table, or they run around the table and pull things off the table, or they run around the house and pull things off all the shelves in the house and keep their parents so busy chasing them around that they have no time whatsoever to interact as adults. Well, you have to wonder under those circumstances whether you're dealing with a child or a dragon, so to speak. And you also might wonder whether or not the dragon is large and unruly, precisely because the parents are completely unwilling to admit that it actually exists. An acquaintance of ours in Boston brought their son over to be babysat at our house, and his nanny had just been in a car accident, so he was being shunted from house to house while his parents went off to work. And he didn't have a very good reputation, this kid. He was about 4. And he came over to our house and with his mother in the morning, and she dropped him off and she said, well, he probably won't eat all day, but that's all right. And I thought, no, he's 4. If he doesn't eat all day, that's not all right, right? Because kids, if they don't eat, they're basically horrible, right? If they don't sleep and they don't eat, they're horrible. So it isn't all right that he doesn't eat. So then you think, well, maybe there's some sort of dragon associated with this child that happens to be interfering perhaps with his ability to eat. So I came back at noon. My wife had taken care of the children that day, and I walked in the house, and the other 4 or 5 kids that we had in the house were off playing, and this little kid was standing in the corner, like really isolated and looking, you know, upset fundamentally. So I went over and I poked him a bunch, because generally if you poke a kid a little bit, you know, well, they'll go like this, you know, they'll sort of back off, but sooner or later you can crack them and they'll smile and then they'll play. Not this kid, boy, there's no bloody way he's going to play with me, and that was that. Like, he'd already learned that adults should either be ignored or that they were trouble, and he wasn't going to let any adult into his little world. So there was absolutely a dragon associated with that little boy, and it was eating all his pancakes. So, you know, you think back in your own experience when you've gone to a house where there's a dragon hiding underneath the living room rug and nobody's saying anything about it, and then you think, how long does it take to get something absolutely simple done in a house that's absolutely jammed to the rafters with unfinished business? Forever, right? Organizing people in a household like that, to even do something as simple as go out for breakfast in the morning, or even perhaps to make a meal, is virtually impossible. Why? Well, because there's something going on in the household that has been studiously ignored for a very long time and has grown so large as a consequence that it occupies the whole domain. You know, that sort of thing happens to people not infrequently too, right? They're not really looking around much at what's going on, and they come home from work one day and their house is gone. And what does that mean? Well, maybe their children have become completely alienated from them, or maybe their wife has decided suddenly, but of course not so suddenly, to leave. Why? Well, according to this story, it's because something ignored was growing in the house. You know, in the 1890s in India, when a house was being built, the local priest, equivalent to the priest, would come by to set the foundation stone, and when he set the foundation stone, he'd take a big spike and drove it into the ground. And the reason he drove it into the ground at the place where the foundation was going to be laid was to keep the great dragon that is underneath the earth firmly pinned down by its head so it couldn't move and shake the house to bits. And what does that mean? Well, it means the same thing that's meant in the New Testament when you're told not to build your house on a foundation of sand, right? It doesn't matter how good the house is or how well constructed it is or how rich it is. If the foundation is made out of sand, or if it rests on top of a dragon, there's nothing in that household that's ever going to be accomplished that's positive. And the wealthy display that the house might consist of is nothing but a sham. So the first thing you might think about is just what happens if you don't pay a bill? Like, really don't pay it. Right? I mean, when it first comes in, it's only the size of a kitten. But if you leave it alone for 2 or 3 years, it pretty much grows into a full-fledged dragon. Why? Well, because things that you ignore have a life of their own, a complex life, like a bill. Bill's attached to a whole industrial complex, right? One of whose major functions is to make sure that you pay the bill. And if you don't pay the bill, then you immediately find out what it's connected to. It's connected to something immense and very troublesome, and if you allow the full force of that thing to manifest itself, it's not pretty. So one lesson from this story is that if something's nagging at you just a bit, it's probably better to deal with it before it turns into a full-fledged dragon.